Seems lower. Good morning, folks. Congressman Joe Crowley, Chair of the Democratic Caucus, joined by the Vice Chair of the Democratic Caucus, Linda Sanchez. We want to welcome you back and welcome us back from our weeks in a week in our district. Part of that time, I spent a day in Puerto Rico to view firsthand the level of devastation that the island has sustained, an understanding that the U.S. Virgin Islands have sustained as bad a situation. I want to thank all the men and women on the ground, men and women in the armed services, some 15,000 individuals who are on the ground in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. I want to thank the men and women at FEMA and Homeland Security and the Coast Guard and all that they're doing to help bring normalcy back to the islands. The damage, as I've said, in my view, is overwhelming. And I think it will require a sustained effort over years, not weeks, not months, but years, to bring the islands back to normalcy. We still have weeks after the hurricane on the island of Puerto Rico, 82% of people without power, 26% without access to adequate drinking water. And that is related to the power issue in terms of the pumping of water. And that really is a formula for disaster and has many public health individuals concerned about what potentially could lie ahead for the people of Puerto Rico. I think the message is loud and clear and needs to be loud and clear from Congress, as well as we hope in the future from the administration as well, that there is no end to the help and support the American people will provide to their fellow Americans in Puerto Rico and in the Virgin Islands. That has to be first and foremost, that we are here to see them brought back to a level of normalcy. I did have the opportunity to meet with the governor as well, and what he did express was the continuing concern that Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands will not be treated fairly as we would another state. And understanding the nuance of a disaster like this on an island somewhat remote from the United States, but that he is still concerned on Medicare, Medicaid, on tax treatment, that they will not be treated fairly, that their concern about the sustained effort is also of concern. And to have that said by the governor to us was, I think, poignant as well. I know that we're going to discuss DACA as well this morning, but I also want to point out that temporary protective status is also something that is coming up for renewal for several countries. It is imperative that we pass that to give peace of mind to those individuals as well. I believe it's inhumane to send individuals who have been living within the law and contributing to our communities back to countries that are still reeling with natural disasters as well as violence. I think that for some of these countries, in particular Haiti, for instance, we know, and Nicaragua, where they're have still coming back from natural disasters, that it really would be heartless to force these families back under those circumstances. We know that the movement ahead that the Republicans are doing in the Senate right now in terms of their budget resolution will be devastating to the American people. It would cut funding to Medicare, to Medicaid. It would have an incredible impact on delivering of needed services to all of our constituents, all in the effort to provide an invasion into the debt once again of $1.5 trillion to give the wealthiest in this country a massive, massive tax cut. And what Democrats have said and continue to say over and over again is that we want to see tax cut relief for the middle class. That's what our primary goal is, to see tax cut relief for the middle class. That we should not borrow money and increase the debt to give tax breaks to the wealthiest in this country. And that the code needs to reflect the need to spur our economy and help job growth. Those are the three issues that I would like to see included in any tax plan moving forward. But this is not tax reform. Let's be clear. Even the president has changed his language now. This is all about a tax cut. And what the president's talking about are the wealthiest people in this country. I don't believe they necessarily deserve a tax cut at this point in time. And many wealthy people don't believe it either. They want to see our country grow in a smart way and help spur the economy so that we can provide opportunities for job growth for the middle class. With that, let me turn to my colleague, Linda Sanchez. Linda.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Republicans are continuing their effort to give tax cuts to the least deserving and the least needy of them, the upper bracket of millionaires and billionaires and corporations. I wouldn't even call this tax cuts, Joe. I would call this a tax fiasco. The budget that we're voting on this week is just an attempt to grease the skids as Republicans try to push this $1.5 trillion unpaid tax cut through Congress. And I don't see, quite frankly, how the Republican tax fiasco is going to help the families that I represent in Southeast Los Angeles County or others like them throughout the country. Republicans insist on the flawed belief that somehow tax cuts are going to pay for themselves. Well, they don't. What ends up happening when we have these massive unpaid for tax cuts is that it drives up the debt, and then suddenly Republicans who become budget hawks and concerned about the deficit end up calling for cuts on the services that working families and middle-class Americans rely on, like Social Security and Medicare. A meaningful and lasting update to our tax code should accomplish a few things. Number one, it should create a simpler and fairer tax code for Americans and small businesses. Number two, it should level the playing field so that American businesses can compete globally. And number three, it should prioritize fairness for all families across the income brackets. From the scant details that they've released on their plan, I don't think that the Republicans are going to achieve any of those goals, quite frankly. Yesterday, I, along with Representative Thompson and Representative Chu, who are members of the Ways and Means Committee from California, sent a letter to Chairman Brady and Senator Hatch on the importance of preserving the state and local tax deduction, otherwise known as SALT. The average value of the SALT deduction in California, just by way of example, for a California household is $18,438. That's a substantial amount of money. And getting rid of SALT will impact homeowners in California and many other states as well, and negatively impact our economy. This is the problem with rushing through a tax cut. We don't have time to debate the long-term consequences of these very poorly thought out policies. And we certainly haven't had the time to study in depth the impact on middle-class Americans, the group of people who Republicans are claiming to want to help the most. But a tax cut in the best of times is a tax plan in the best of times is a very heavy lift. In this environment, we have seen no bipartisan outreach to try to work with Democrats on something that is balanced and something that is fair. And the hit to middle-income families across this country could be enormous if we're not careful. So just a word of caution to my Republican colleagues, you will reap what you sow in tax reform. So I'm encouraging them to really try to sit down at the table with Democrats to think seriously about the policies that they are promoting, which by every account benefits the wealthiest income earners in this country. As Joe said, we were on district work period last week. Last week I had an opportunity to meet with Dreamers at Cal State Fullerton, hear their stories and hear their frustrations about their own members of Congress that refuse to meet with them, that refuse even to accept letters that they've written to them that they've tried to deliver to their offices. Congressman Ed Royce and Congresswoman Mimi Walters in particular have refused to meet with these groups of students, some of whom are constituents. They've refused to even open their office doors to them. In one instance, security was called to tell these people that they have no right to enter a building where there is a congressional office that is paid for by taxpayer money. If representatives refuse to meet with the very constituents that they represent, they are not doing their jobs adequately. And I think that that is a despicable attack on democracy. It's a cowardly act to try to run from an issue on which these colleagues know that they are in the wrong. So I encourage folks to continue to try to find creative ways to get their message across to their members of Congress, because our salaries are paid for by taxpayer money. We have an obligation to meet with constituents, or at least to accept correspondence that they are writing to us on an issue that impacts them and their communities. And with that, I will pass it back over to Joe.
Thank you. Linda? Yes, sir.
Do you think that it's wise for Democratic leaders like Pelosi and Hoyer to be financially backing candidates in races where there is no incumbent? And do you see it as a way of picking favorites?
Are you talking about in a primary?
In primaries where there's no incumbent, Pelosi and Hoyer have been financially backing several different candidates. Do you see it as picking favorites?
Well, I think that they have an opportunity to make evaluations as to those districts. I don't know specifically which districts you're talking about, but members have that right and ability to do that if they choose to do that, as do Linda, myself, and others as well.
But specifically the leadership, do you think that it sends a signal of picking favorites in these open races?
I'm not aware of the races you're talking about, so.
Kirkpatrick is one of them in Arizona.
Well, I think if you look at Ms. Kilpatrick, she's a former colleague of ours. She's run twice before and was successful. So I think there is a personal relationship that exists. I will also be helping Ms. Kilpatrick as well. So there is a relationship that exists going back a number of years here. I don't know if that's necessarily an example that I would necessarily use to highlight that point.
Yeah, I would just add it, many of these races are based on personal relationships that people may have, or with candidates, or viability of candidates. We are interested in winning back the majority of the House, and individual members are free to assist candidates that they think share their values and have the best chance of winning.
Is there any realistic scenario where you could see Democrats working with Republicans on something, given the approach they're taking now? And does it actually benefit you guys to do that if that scenario pops up, given that many Republicans say if they fail on this, you guys can take back the House much easier?
Well, I think when they put in those terms, it's really a call to arms to their folks, whether they agree with the bill or not, that you have to vote for it because their political survival or the majority is on the line, not putting forward what is the best policy, what is the best policy to help the American people move forward. What I've said consistently, I think Democrats have been saying, is that we recognize the code is overly complicated because it's inefficient, that in many respects the code is unfair, and that it doesn't actually, the code doesn't favor producing jobs in the United States. It actually encourages job production overseas. Those are things I think Democrats and Republicans can agree on. It's how we approach this, and so far, and I know it's not about process because no one cares about process, but Democrats have been excluded from that discussion. What I do say to my friends in the business community in the world, you do not want partisan tax bills. They don't have longevity. There is uncertainty that is built into a bill that is produced in that partisan type of way. When you go back 30 years ago, this past Sunday was commemorating or celebration of the passage of a bipartisan tax bill during the Reagan-O'Neill years. And why it had longevity is because it was a bipartisan bill. And I would stress to folks in the business community in particular who are concerned about this, that you want to see a bipartisan bill. You do not want to see a partisan tax bill passed. And so far, the Republicans have indicated they will use reconciliation in order to minimize or diminish any involvement of the minority in the Senate as it pertains to tax. So I think they've already indicated so far they're not interested in working with Democrats. As I said before, we want a tax bill that addresses the needs of the middle class and the working folks of our country. We also want to do it without blowing out our national debt. And their bill would create an additional $1.5 trillion hole in the nation's debt. They can spin it any way they like, but that is the fact. Caucus said it himself. He's voting for the resolution. At the same time, he said he won't vote for a bill that actually increases the debt by a penny. Yet they opened the door by passing this resolution to increase it not by just a penny, but by $1.5 trillion. It's a big difference.
But is it smart politics if the opportunity did pop up for you guys to work with them, given that you could take back the House if they crash and burn?
Look, they haven't even offered to talk to us about it. So you're asking a hypothetical question that we've been asking for quite some time, and they continue to ignore us. So, when are we supposed to get the message? They don't want us to be involved. We're getting it. Yes.
What is the latest on DACA? Have Republican leaders reached out to you guys, and are you optimistic that there will be some sort of?
The latest we've heard, and what I've read this morning, is that there may be an effort afoot with Senator Graham and Senator Flake and others to come up with a bill that they think will pass muster with Democrats and Republicans. I can't comment on it because I don't know the details of it. I would just suggest that the list that was put forward by Mr. Miller, I won't call him President Miller anymore, I'll call him Mr. Miller because I know they got Mr. Bannon in trouble when we called him President Bannon, so we'll just call him Mr. Miller. When Mr. Miller offered his list of requirements to address the issue of the DACA individuals, each one of those requirements in and of themselves was rejected and would be rejected if it was individually offered in terms of a compromise on DACA. We're talking about the lives of 800,000 individuals who are American in every way except in documentation. And those are the folks we're talking about, fragile souls who need to have this issue addressed because for many of them it is a life and death issue. Well, thank you all very, very much. Hope you all have a great week. Oh,
One piece of good news. Dodgers are going to the World Series. Sorry about those Yanks.
I'm a Mets fan.
Sorry,
so
sorry.
thank you all.